Perfect. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us. My name is Khalid Ismail. I'm one of the graduate assistants in campus inclusion community here at Northwestern University. And I have with me the assistant directors for campus inclusion for social justice education. I'm here, Noor Ali and Michelle Enos. I want to say welcome to the first CIC Talks webinar of this year. This is a new program that we're starting that will live in campus inclusion community and hopefully tackle some conversations that need to be happening on this campus. Today's conversation is going to be centered around cultural appropriation. So before we get started, Noor and Michelle, do you want to introduce yourselves to our viewers and tell us a little bit about your work and about social justice education here at Northwestern?
Yeah, sure. So hi everyone, welcome. We're really excited to welcome you to the first CIC Talks webinar. My name is Noor Ali and I'm one of the assistant directors here at Social Justice Education.
And my name is Michelle Enos and I am the other assistant director.
So we do a number of things, a number of programs through our office. SJE, Social Justice Education, houses what we call PI, or Peer Inclusion Educators, and I oversee that program where we train students to become peer facilitators and do different social justice workshops all over campus. Keep your eye out for our training next month. I also oversee our bystander intervention program along with a partner in CARE, Paul Ang, and so doing the Step Up bystander intervention programs, trainings and workshops across campus.
And so some of the things that I do is I oversee the Sustained Dialogue program on campus, which some of you might have heard of. And then I also work closely with fraternity and sorority life, as well as athletics, and do programs and trainings with them. And then Nora and I both work for all of campus to do trainings with a variety of student groups. And hopefully I'm not repeating myself, I don't think you said this. If you all haven't heard of social justice education before, it's because we haven't had this office until just September 1st. So we are very much a brand new office, though Nora and I aren't new to Northwestern. This office is brand new to campus, and this is one of our new initiatives that we have started here.
Awesome. And when you say this is one of offices in campus inclusion community, what are the other offices that are in our department?
Yeah. So Campus Inclusion Community houses 3 departments. SJE is one of them. We also have MSA, our Multicultural Student Affairs office, and then we also have the Student Enrichment Services office, SES.
Fantastic. So why don't we just dive right in? This conversation is meant to be more informal, so we're just going to kind of ask each other some questions and process cultural appropriation together because it's a big topic to tackle in an hour. For our viewers, if at any point you have any questions, at the top corner of your screen you should be able to select in a menu a Q&A portion, and you can post any of your questions there if you have them, or comments. You can also use Twitter and just tweet with the hashtag CIC Talks. I'll be checking those throughout our program here tonight to make sure that we get your questions in and that you can engage with us in our conversation. We'll leave some time at the end for that. So yeah, without further ado, Michelle and Noor, why don't you tell me a little bit about what is cultural appropriation, how you define it in your work and in your thinking right now?
Yeah. So as we were kind of preparing for this, Nora and I felt like we know what cultural appropriation is, but we're really trying to find a really succinct definition, which we wanted to kind of name the fact that that's really hard to do, either whether you're doing it through Google or if you're just trying to look through research on different diversity, social justice terms or experiences. There really isn't one succinct definition of cultural appropriation. And through our Googling, right, I mean, you get a wide variety of definitions, or obviously a very wide variety of how people feel about the term cultural appropriation, right? So one of the ones that stuck with me right off the bat, because it tends to be the top thing when you Google things, is Urban Dictionary, right? And this idea of cultural appropriation being an opportunity for people to tell others what they can and cannot do, specifically white people, what they can and cannot do, and that it's kind of this bunk term, which is obviously incredibly problematic. So one of the things that Nora and I wanted to make sure that we did in finding a definition is to honor the fact that cultural appropriation really is a form of racism. And so that means it's more than just about the individual. It's about a system that is at play, as well as the history of this country. And so to make sure that I cover the definition that we feel is really appropriate and what we'll be going off of for the rest of this conversation, I will read what we have here, which is that cultural appropriation is the act of taking the very physical, mental, or social features of a marginalized group and using them to belittle, mischaracterize, and otherwise isolate them and embody those features for personal, social entertainment, or monetary gain. So it kind of reminds me of our definition of inclusion in the sense that there's a lot there.
Yeah, can you break it down for us a little bit?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say the hope is that we'll break it down a little bit here, and then obviously throughout the rest of this conversation, we want to kind of break down each of the pieces of that. And so for me, breaking it down, what comes up right away, right, is the fact that it's really about taking from a marginalized group, right? So right away, you're kind of setting up this idea that this isn't necessarily about anyone being able to appropriate someone's culture, but it's more about whose culture are we appropriating and that there's different impacts. And it's really more about taking from a marginalized group. And then that also takes into account, as I said, the fact that there's systems at play, right? So it's not just about what I as an individual do, but what I do as I operate within this system. So I very much think of the terms discrimination, prejudice, and oppression, right? And so thinking about those definitions in an example, right? Discrimination is thinking about something or about someone in a specific way, but not necessarily acting on that. Prejudice is then the individual action because of my thoughts. And then there's discrimination, which happens on, then there's oppression, which happens on the institutional level. So my example of that, right, is in thinking about gender, one can look at a woman and right off the bat assume that she's weak, right? And so that's just my assumption. I'm not necessarily acting on that. But then my actions and my prejudice would be then to, my discrimination against that would be to open up the door for her, to pick up all these boxes, to tell her she can't do any of this. Like, I've got this for you, right? As a woman, I think you're weaker. And so now I'm acting upon those thoughts. The oppression, though, in terms of gender, right, is then that women also do not make as much money as men. So I'm not necessarily doing that individually, or a man isn't doing that individually, but it's happening on a systemic level. So it's greater than any of us, which, as we talk about today, are going to be some of the examples that we give for cultural appropriation, that it's individuals operating within this system.
Great, thank you so much for clarifying that. Noor, do you have anything to add to that definition or to that explanation?
So I think, I think Michelle really covered it, and it's really difficult to, it's a very abstract thing, and that's why we're going to go into a lot of different examples. But I think what's really important from the things that I hear Michelle telling us is that, you know, it's wrapped up in power and privilege. There is a certain element of identity around this. And like she said, you know, it doesn't happen just parallel, but that it's a very much a top-down approach. I think what's really important for us to be thinking about is, why is it harmful? So what's the big deal with this? And so there are really three things that we want to hit home, and we'll use to summarize around like the harms of cultural appropriation. First and foremost, it perpetuates and promotes stereotypes. So what Michelle was talking about were some stereotypes about women. Those are maybe sometimes on an individual level, but then how those can reach then on an oppressive systematic level. But you know, many times when someone is appropriating someone's culture, whether it's through dress, whether it's through dance, whether it's through act, those things are oftentimes perpetuating and promoting harmful stereotypes that I think put down another group. The second thing is that folks with privilege are then taking credit for things that aren't theirs, and not just taking credit for it, but then they get praise for it. So you'll see a white person, don dreadlocks or be able to wear something, and it's seen as innovative and stylish and hip and cool. And then you see in Black culture that it's been done for years, for centuries, and it's seen as unprofessional and unacceptable. And so it's that type of thing. And we'll talk more about examples of how that shows up. And then the third thing that's really important for us is that it really dilutes the significance of a culture. And so, while someone may wear something and think, oh, this is really great, it's really beautiful, whatever. Many times these artifacts or these pieces of one's culture hold a very high significance. We're going to show a video actually, and that'll give us a little bit of a summary of what we've covered. Do you have any questions before then, Khaled?
No, I think we can watch the video. If you're just joining us right now, we've covered a little bit about what cultural appropriation is for us, and we're going to go into some more examples as we move along in this webinar. So thanks for joining us, and go ahead, Noor, if you want to switch the page to the video.
So the video, just to give you some context, and some of you may have seen this floating around Facebook, but it's a BuzzFeed video looking at also cultural appropriation in terms of Halloween costumes, which is really, timely, seeing as Halloween's next week. So this is something to keep in mind as we come to this holiday.
Here, it looks like we just saw an example of how cultural appropriation could show up for Halloween. Noor and Michelle, I heard a few things in that video that maybe we can flesh out a little bit more. The first one was kind of the history and significance of different pieces in costumes that is often missed in representations that are trivial. And then also I heard folks talk about like believing when somebody tells you something is offensive, and I know we'll talk a little bit more about that, but can we maybe flesh those 2 points out right now, because they seem to be into the harm of cultural appropriation?
Did you want to get some notes?
If you want to answer that, yeah, there was another note that I had too that I'll tack on to something else that I thought was really relevant in what they said as well.
So I think, how did you highlight some important pieces? So this idea, like, again, that diluting of the significance. Remember, just to remind folks, there were three things to summarize what's so harmful about cultural appropriation. Obviously, there are more than 3 things, but these are 3 themes that oftentimes we see. 1, it promotes and it perpetuates stereotypes. 2, people take credit for things that aren't theirs, and they get praise for them. And then 3, it's diluting significance. And I think from this video, we see a lot around diluting significance. And so you heard individuals talk about how much work goes into this, and how little accuracy there were in the costumes, how it felt like people were making fun of them, and also how much significance, so prayers, so like it's not just like the physical labor, but the actual like belief and ritual and just personal significance. And so when someone is donning such a primitive or trivial example of this like larger culture, larger significance, it feels very much like mocking. Yeah.
And similar to what Noor brought up, right? So this idea of the primitive, and what I thought was really powerful, and what one of the men shared too, is that it keeps us in the past, and it keeps Native Americans in the past as if this is what we are, and as if we're not real anymore, like we're not relevant anymore, right? And to me, that's really powerful for a number of reasons. And one of them being, right, once we get at the system right here, and like who is shown in the media, in the news, in every day, right? Like, how do we see people every single day? And we don't see Native Americans all the time, right? And so if this is one of the few ways in which we see Native Americans being represented, the thought is always in the past, right? Like, we don't ever get a realistic, updated, now, like 2015 version of what it really means to be Native American. It's always in the past, which is obviously incredibly problematic. It's always primitive. It's always very like savages kind of thought, right? Versus, like she said, if you dress as Vikings or you dress as people who no longer exist anymore, that's very, very different. And it's also very different if you dress as someone who has an identity that's always shown in the media in a different way, right? So it's like, okay, yeah, maybe at Halloween you're shown this way, but in every other form of media, or I see you every day in a very different way, but Native Americans are never shown differently. So you're just continuing to perpetuate this old, like, savage, racist stereotype.
I think what would be a good exercise for folks to do is like if you sat down and you wrote ethnic groups, you wrote down Arabs, you wrote down Latinos, you wrote down Native Americans, and you think costume, what's going to come to mind? And those stereotypes of what those costumes might look like. Oftentimes, you look up Arab costumes, you see someone like Kufia with like a white dress, and that's perpetuating the stereotype that Arabs are riding camels and don't have buildings and cars. Same thing with other cultural groups. And this video, I think, really highlights. One person specifically said, "You can't wear my culture as a costume." And that's what it's really doing. It's minimizing an entire group and their entire experience to, oh, I'm just gonna have fun. I want to look exotic. I want to look unique or original by wearing this costume that's totally unoriginal and totally unauthentic.
And I hear people say sometimes things like, you wearing somebody's culture as a costume, you're stripping it away of the history of that community. You can't take off, like I can't take off my history, I can't take off my culture, I can't take off my skin. Where for you to be able to put all of that on and take it off just for fun is extremely problematic. So Michelle, earlier tonight we were having a conversation about this, and we were talking about blackface specifically. And I thought you brought up some really important points about the history of blackface and the harm that it has. So can you maybe touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, so sorry, I have a cold.
No, that's okay. That's okay.
So we were talking earlier and giving some examples, right? And so I think we've talked a lot about Halloween and talking a lot about dressing up as cultures, as costumes, but I think we see this happen all the time, right, on college campuses. I mean, let's date ourselves. Like I graduated in 2007, and we were fighting every year for all of the racist stereotypical parties that were being thrown. So this is nothing new to college campuses, right? And Halloween, I think, is just an example of when it happens maybe on a larger scale. But I think blackface happens on college campuses all the time, and I think most recently it was the Kanye Western party, right? And so I think this idea on an individual level, like, I really like Kanye, I want to be able to just express myself and show perhaps my appreciation and love for his music and who he is, or perhaps I just think it's like really funny, right? Maybe I don't like Kanye, but I think he's a little absurd sometimes and I want to dress like him. Whatever it may be, dressing up and putting on blackface is bigger than just one person. And so oftentimes what's incredibly problematic, and I guess maybe in defense of people, right, we aren't taught this, right? We aren't taught our history in schools typically. So the history of blackface and where it came from, right? It's not just you putting on whatever you decide to put on to represent blackface. It's understanding where blackface comes from, and that in the theater, whites were using blackface to put it on and to act out plays and do theatrical performances of slaves and Black people in very racist ways. So it was eating watermelon, it was being absurdly strong and athletic, it was being incredibly stupid, it was being very happy-go-lucky despite being in slavery, right? And just these really awful racist tropes that were then perpetuated, and then that Black people actually were pushed into wearing blackface themselves. And the history of what blackface has meant and how it has represented Black people. And then obviously we know what's happening with the Black community today, right? And the rate in which Black people are being murdered and how racism is still alive and prevalent. And so you're just continuing to perpetuate these racist stereotypes through blackface, right? So it's taking it out of the individual and putting it in the history and in the institution that still exists today.
So I think,
thank you for that.
I think Michelle, is pulling us into another theme or another piece of the webinar that we want to kind of get into, and that's where does this show up? And we've given the examples, some examples of and mainly around Halloween, and now also around like sometimes some parties, and but this happens, like Michelle said, all the time. Things from going to buy certain things from a thrift shop all the way up to national and international celebrations like Cinco de Mayo, when problematic stereotypes come out and people are really thinking that they're appreciating but actually appropriating a culture in a way that's very harmful to that group. And so things like, specifically thinking about in music, in festivals, in different sports, in fashion, these things show up a lot. One thing that when Michelle was talking came to mind in terms of, not just like being able to don someone's culture, but then also being able to be some kind of advocate for the struggle that people go through. Is many students might have heard about what Nicki Minaj said to Miley Cyrus. And so Miley Cyrus has been known to don different pieces that are part of Black culture. You'll see her in dreadlocks, you'll see her twerking. So again, it's not just what someone wears, but also the actions or the acts that people take on. Even like in terms of rap, in terms of different pieces, you see many of the music artists taking on certain pieces that are from Black culture. And Nicki Minaj saying, hey, back up, Miley. You can't just like take on our culture when it's convenient for you, and when you want to have fun, but then not be part of our struggle. And I'm totally butchering the quote, but I mean that's really the message that Nicki was sending, and that's really significant. And that's oftentimes what people are saying when you put on a costume or when you put on a Native American headdress. It's not just about that day, because you can take that off. When someone puts blackface on, they can wash their face. Later, like someone can't do that. And I can't come out of the stereotypes that people have about me and my culture. And so pretending that donning a piece of my culture and then being able to take that off later is somehow going to be appreciative is a facade.
So I want to remind folks that you're able to ask questions if they come up or make any comments to engage in conversation. So in the top corner of your page, you should be able to select the menu and there's a Q&A option. So please go ahead and submit any questions or comments that you have. You can also tweet them using the hashtag CIC Talks, and I'm checking those as well. But as I hear you kind of talk, I'm like thinking about people who will say things like, well, freedom of expression or freedom of, speech. Like I should be able to do whatever I want. Yes, it's problematic. Yes, all of the things that you've been mentioning, but I can do whatever I want. Like you can't stop me. How would you engage those folks in the conversation?
I think, Michelle, you were saying this before, so I don't know if you want to share sort of what we were talking about before we started.
Yeah, I mean, I think with any training that Nora and I do, or anything that any conversation we've ever had, I think it's never about what you can and can't do, or what you can and cannot say, or how you can and cannot act, right? So fundamentally, at the end of the day, like you can do whatever you want. So someone can turn away from this and say like, how do I not? I'm like, I don't want to curse. Like this was crap. This was BS, and I don't believe it, and I don't want anything to do with it. And like, while that's not okay, and that doesn't sit well with me, like that's your choice. And you have a choice in this matter. What we're saying to you is that if you choose to engage in blackface, your actions are racist. That's just it, and that's just what that is, right? If you're choosing to dress up as a Native American character, then you're choosing to engage in racist behaviors. And so what does that mean? And is that what you want to do? And is that the impact that you want to have on people within your community here at Northwestern, right? And those are questions and those are answers that someone has to understand for themselves. So you can choose to engage in this behavior, but there are always consequences to people's actions. And so that doesn't mean you don't necessarily get to stay at Northwestern, right? That doesn't mean there's consequences like monetarily or with you being part of this community, but that means that, you're perhaps cutting ties with people, you're negatively impacting people, you're oppressing other people. And is that the kind of person that you want to be, right? And those are what we're trying to challenge, like who do you want to be? And how do you want to be a part of a community? Because essentially at the end of the day, we can't control your behavior. Mm-hmm. but we can hopefully shed some light on the impact that you're having on people and how your behavior is impacting others. And is that the kind of person you want to be?
And there are two things I'd like to add, kind of, if we have time.
Yeah, please go for it.
One is like, like Michelle is saying, like, we're not telling you what to say or what to do. What we are saying is that it's going to be racist. And we're not going to come around and police people. Like, no one's sitting there saying, oh, you can't say this, you can't say that. Intent and impact have a huge, like a lot of people in our workshops, and a lot of people when we talk about power and privilege are like, my intention isn't bad, therefore I'm not a bad person. We often say, like, okay, well, if you stepped on someone's foot and you hurt them, you would clearly apologize and you do your best not to step on their foot again. Why would we engage in something that is potentially and very realistically harming people, just because, oh, that's not my intention, and so realizing the idea here for today in this webinar is really to shed light on what the impact is. Now, what someone decides to do after that is their prerogative.
Mm-hmm. And I think, so something that Nor said, I don't know why I want to say this now. Maybe this doesn't completely make sense now. And I think for me, what comes up when you were talking is that it feels individual in the moment, right? So when I think to parties where people are dressing up like ghetto, right, or like gangsters, right? And let's, like, when we say who's ghetto and who are gangsters, what comes to our mind? Like, let's be real about, like, we're dressing up as, like, people are dressing up as people of color, right? It's usually the Black and Latino community. And what immediately comes to mind is you see people who stuff their shirts to be pregnant. You see people dressing up as gangbangers. You see people dressing up with, like, guns, all of those kinds of very racist things, right? People are like, it's just a joke. It's funny. It's not a big deal. There's white trash parties, right? Like, it's kind of the response. And so what we fail to take into account is that this isn't just an individual thing, because when people of color, when Black men walk into a room for a job interview, they're less likely to get a job. When Latino men, like, these are things that are stereotypes that do impact people today. So if your thought is, I want to dress this way because it's a stereotype, and that's the first stereotype that comes to mind, that's going to be the stereotype that you have when you're hiring someone for a job. That's the stereotype that someone has when they're hiring people for jobs, or when, a police officer is viewing a man of color as a threat when they're not really a threat. So these very real stereotypes that play out in costumes also are playing out in the job market, also are playing out in life and death situations, also are playing out in the prison industrial complex as to why men of color are all being put into prisons more, right? So, like, it's funny when it's a costume, but when it plays out in the real world, it's not funny anymore because it's real, and it's how people really think about other people, and it really has an impact. And that is the reason why this is bigger than just a costume and just a party, right?
For one person, it's a costume and it's a party and you can take it off, but for everyone else, it's not something they can take off.
And as a white person, there can be a million white trash parties thrown all over colleges everywhere, and that's not okay, and that might not make someone feel good. But I can also walk into a job interview and dress a certain way, and I don't have to ever worry about someone making that assumption about me, because that's not how me and my race are viewed every single day or portrayed every single day. So there's a difference there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a couple of questions kind of come up for me as I hear you talk, Michelle. So we talked a little bit about intent versus impact. So tell me a little bit about what somebody could do in terms of, as they think about a Halloween costume for next week. Like, what should you do? Should you go ask your Native American friend if their costume is racist, for example?
So that's a quick no, hard no.
Don't go ask someone. Just because one person says yes, then that doesn't necessarily be true for everyone.
Right. So one of the things we always hand out when we're doing trainings are group norms. And I think one of my absolute favorite group norms is just because you are does not mean you understand. Mm-hmm. And I think that's always a very interesting thing, right? Because it's like, but I am who I am, so I understand myself. And unfortunately, that's just not always the case. So I don't inherently understand what it means to be a woman, right? I cannot speak for all women. And I sure as hell can't speak for all women as a white woman, right? Because there's a lot of privilege in my whiteness. So I say that because if someone comes up to me and says, is this sexist, Michelle? Can I do this? I might say, no, that's not sexist. That's great. Go ahead. And then Nor's like, oh my God, that is really freaking sexist, right? And I don't necessarily always know what it means to be a woman at every time. That might not be my most salient identity. And even if I know what that means for me, that it's not what that means for Noor. So I say all that to say, it is also not my job to speak on behalf of all of my gender, just like it is not a person of color's job to speak on behalf of their entire race. Mm-hmm. So no, don't go up to your friend who is that identity and say like, can I wear this? Especially because if you all are really good friends and you might have some like inside jokes that are like probably pretty problematic, but they're okay between the two of you. Like, who knows, right? They could say yes. And then like, I wish you the best of luck out there, right? Like you're perpetuating oppression and you're continuing to be racist because you went off of one person's decision because they have that identity. Versus, I think, and you know, you all can push back about this, I think it's another thing to have a group of friends, not based on identity, but based on like knowledge, and they're into having social justice conversations. And like, right, like Nora and I will have conversations about like, oh my gosh, like, can we talk more about this and what does this mean? And maybe I'm thinking of doing this or I'm thinking of doing that. And because we have these conversations and we're educated about issues and subjects, like that's a different like community to bounce ideas off of, right? It's not because of your identity. It's because we have these conversations. Or I know that like this friend of mine is really into social justice issues and I just want to talk to them about like, what is appropriation? And I'm thinking of going for this as Halloween. Can we talk more about this?
Or how can I be appreciative of a culture? I mean, I've heard of some people saying, well, you know, I really respect the late Whitney Houston and I wanna dress up as Whitney Houston. You know, like, you know, maybe there's a way to do that that's appreciative and that's not going to be culturally appropriative. And maybe it's definitely not donning blackface, but it's a way of like, you know, put something on that, you know, but the idea is to be thinking, well, if I'm not a black person and I'm donning this costume, if I'm not a person of color and I'm donning a costume that refers to a culture for people of color, what is the privilege around that? I need to be conscious. So I think, you know, in terms of, you know, who you have around you, and if you're trying to grow, it's about that self-reflection, you know, what are my identities? And how do those then interact with others? What privileges? Do I have to think about this all the time? Do I have to think about my race all the time? And in what ways do I have to think about my race? And if I'm going to don a costume or I'm going to don, some Urban Outfitters outfit that has some kind of Native American cultural appropriative piece or something, like, how am I doing that? Or how am I conscious of like, well, how do my identities interact with people of that culture? And really, is this going to be appropriative or not? Again, we go back to this intent versus impact. If someone the intention is to be appreciative, that doesn't mean that everyone's going to, feel that it's being appreciated. It feels like the culture, again, is being mocked, is being seen as primitive, and is being, in like all of a sudden it's like cool when you're wearing it, but it's not cool when I, as a person of color, am wearing it.
And something you brought up, Khalid, earlier, and I don't think we talked about, and that what you're saying, Nora, is bringing up for me too, right, is like what I think is always inherently hard, tough, about social justice work, right, is that this is not a yes or a no question. It's not a right or a wrong. Okay, we could argue there's a lot of wrong, but not everyone is going to agree, right, that like this is inherently right and this is inherently wrong. So you can do your absolute best to be like, to do your research, to ask, to have a conversation with friends, to be really self-aware and still feel like you're appreciating a culture, and it could still really, really perpetuate something that maybe you overlooked, or someone comes up to you and says like, that's really racist and this is how this is impacting me. This is not a math equation, and there's no way to always guarantee that you're going to get it right. So when we go back to intent versus impact, how then do I take responsibility, even when maybe I did do my best not to appropriate and not to perpetuate racism, right? How am I taking responsibility? How am I listening? And I heard, Cleve, what you said, the one guy in the video that I really appreciated was like, I'm an expert on my culture. Like, how come I don't get to tell you when something's offensive, right? So I think another thing that's incredibly important in doing any social justice work is when someone comes up to you and says, like, this is offensive, this is racist, this is how this is impacting me.
That should be enough.
Be quiet and just listen, right? It's like, oh, wow. And no, that doesn't feel good. And like one of the worst things I think you can tell a white person is that they were acting racist, right? It's like the worst thing you can ever hear. Like as a white person, I don't ever want to hear that. But the best thing I can do is listen and say like, oh my gosh, I need to do some more work. Like I made a huge mistake. And I just have to take responsibility for that. And hopefully I have a relationship with the person who challenged me, because if they're challenging me, my assumption is maybe there's a relationship there that we can talk more about it. And then if they don't want to talk about it and they don't want to be the educator, then I have to go and do that on my own and figure that out. But I can't get defensive. I can't tell them they're being too sensitive. Because like Noor said, right, I don't step on someone's toe and tell them to shut up when they tell me it hurts, right? Like we all, wow, that'd be like really mean. So like, why is that okay for me to do when I'm telling you that I'm offended or hurt or that you're racist, right? So how am I taking responsibility, truly taking responsibility and kind of swallowing my pride and doing my own self-work in that moment and, you know, in the future? And I feel like I just rambled a lot, but.
No, that was perfect. So
3 minutes.
We're good. So I want to remind folks that you can ask us questions, make comments. What is this making you feel? How are you reacting to some of the things we're saying? Please feel free to use the option if you just select the menu in the corner of your screen, or you can tweet using the hashtag CIC Talks. I'm screening through those right now. But I want to turn back to Michelle and Noor for some closing thoughts, and then kind of thinking about what can we do. So we've kind of touched about some like action points of how to go about avoiding cultural appropriation, or when you step in it, how to make sure that you take responsibility for your actions. But what would you say your takeaways are from this webinar?
Really quickly before we move into the closure, Khaled, I think we're talking a lot about an individual like me being culturally appropriative. I think it's also important to notice when cultural appropriation happens and to intervene when that happens, to be able to say, hey, maybe this isn't, you shouldn't wear this costume, or maybe you shouldn't be wearing this. And I think noticing that, and maybe it's because I did a bystander intervention training today, but noticing that this is happening is also extremely important to create a culture of inclusion, of support and allyhood in some ways on our campus. Right. And that's something that I think we need to be cultivating. Right. It's not just about let me take care of me, but how am I also looking out that I know Michelle's a great person. She doesn't mean to do anything harmful to other people, but maybe I can check her when I see her do something that potentially could be very offensive to people. I think part of that is also noticing when this happens. So I know I mentioned earlier that things happen at festivals, things happen on Cinco de Mayo, things happen in sports, in fashion. But to name just some of those examples, a lot of times you go to, Lollapalooza and you see people in like these huge Native American headdresses. That's an example of cultural appropriation. Perhaps it's seen as like fashionable or cool, but again, this is taking on something that's extremely culturally significant and making it just a fashion item or just some piece of a fad. Looking at the runways in Fashion Week, so many pieces are culturally appropriative. It's taking a piece that perhaps has been donned by people over centuries and centuries, and it's reworking it, and all of a sudden it's seen as so innovative. And again, when somebody from that group dons that item, it's all of a sudden seen as primitive, and that's not great, and it's old-fashioned, and why are you so backward? But then when somebody of privilege puts that on, it's seen as fashion forward. So I think noticing these events, being conscious of when this happens, paying attention to it, is not only to avoid it for yourself, but it's also to realize that to create a culture of inclusion on our campus, we need to be cultivating a culture of awareness around these things.
Right, and how powerful, right, for I imagine, so, in my white identity, right, so I can speak from experience, like how powerful for me to challenge another white person around this, and instead of like letting a person of color having to bear that burden, right? So if there's a homogenous group of people who are together and someone is doing something that is cultural appropriative, that is racist, like how powerful for me to stand up and say like, no, not cool, instead of waiting until we come across a group of people that is the target of that, right? Which I appreciate you saying, Nor. And for me, I think, you know, the shameless plug, and I know we're going to do this at the end anyways, right, is that as, you know, Sustained Dialogue is hosting a session on Monday evening at 8 o'clock in Fisk Hall, and it's really just a space to continue this conversation. And so as we think about moving into that conversation, or even just like watching this video, which is recorded and we can watch over and over again, which I'm super excited about, like what are some of the takeaways and what are we going to talk about when we leave this space? And so, you know, my questions are, you know, like what is the draw? What is the pull to dressing a certain way, right? Like I think we're thinking very much in terms of like of dress, right? I think we see that very often. So like, why do I want to throw this party? Or why do I want to dress up in this way? Why do I think this is funny? Like what stereotypes is this playing off of? And as we talked about earlier, and how is this really happening in the real world, right? So how is this funny now, but in the real world, this means like joblessness, homelessness, prison, sometimes even like death. Like how does this play out in the real world when these stereotypes are actually perpetuated outside of a funny joke party? And what is the impact that me dressing up this way or appropriating a culture or continuing these racist ideas have on a person or a group of people? And then what stops us from listening when someone comes and says that they have been offended or that I am being racist or that I am perpetuating oppression? Like what stops me from just hearing that, believing it and listening, or walking away and or saying thank you for telling me, like thanking the person and really being sincere in that? And what's like stopping us from taking responsibility for our actions? Mm-hmm. And what comes up when we get, I experience a lot of defensiveness sometimes, like don't tell me what to do and what I can and cannot wear. And why are we holding so strongly to that, right? Instead of holding so strongly to wanting to make sure that people don't experience oppression, right? Like why does me dressing up matter more than the liberation of a group of people? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't know about closing thoughts, but
yeah.
Well, I think you've definitely given us a lot to think about. I appreciate you bringing up the space next week to talk more about this. So Sustained Dialogue is putting on an open space on campus for folks to come together and just engage in this conversation further with each other, process this together, and really learn to both dialogue and listen at the same time, and hopefully walk away from that space with more learning to do, more dialogue to be happening on campus, and just ways to get involved in making this a better place for all of us. I haven't seen any questions come in our Q&A session and or in our Twitter feed right now. So if you have any closing thoughts, we can go to that. But otherwise, yeah, thank you both so much. I appreciate you and taking the time to process this with me tonight.
I'm sorry. I had a text message from a friend saying that they're having trouble figuring out how to ask questions.
Okay.
Perhaps maybe on the Facebook group or the event on Facebook, we can also have people ask questions. I don't know if that's possible.
So at the top of the page, there's going to be like a few boxes. Like they're like tiny little boxes that look like a menu icon. And when you click on it, it should say Q&A. So you're able to do that. You're also able to tweet using hashtag CIC Talks. And please, if you have any questions, you can post them on the Facebook page as well. I will pull that up right now as well.
I think, you know, we gave the shameless plug about SD, but, you know, if you're interested in having these conversations, or you think that your group on campus would benefit from having these kinds of conversations, this is what Michelle and I do. This is our job on campus, to be able to facilitate these kinds of conversations. So please feel free to, you know, visit our website for, I don't know what the website is. I should know that.
Go to like Northwestern's website, Google social justice education.
Yeah, social justice education.
Guess it. Or also,
and you can request a workshop at any time.
Right. Or if you just want to swing by our office. I mean, we talked about like resources to continue these conversations, or not that we can tell you, yes, this is racist or no, this isn't, but we could continue even like a one-on-one conversation, or like if you just want to talk and say like, this happened, I don't understand like why this was that way, or I'm trying to process something, like outside of workshops.
We love
Nora and I just like talking about this all the time.
We do,
so,
it's our life.
So we're here to just swing by and also have a conversation as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and you were right. So our website is northwestern.com/social justice. So pretty simple. And you can also look up campus inclusion community on there to learn more about our departments. I don't know if Alejandro was able to find any of the question feature. So I think
we're good then.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, hold on one minute. Please mention the location change, the SD pop-up, to low seats 214 from Ariana. She just tweeted us. So perfect.
Yay.
So Ariana is one of our Sustained Dialogue leadership teamers, and she is letting folks know that the Sustained Dialogue location on Monday has changed to, I don't know if it's low-key or low-seat. Do you know what the hall is called?
I think if you pronounce it both ways, people will know.
Yeah, students.
Okay, so Loki 214, LOCY 214 is the room number for the Sustained Dialogue pop-up on Monday. Again, thank you all for joining us for this first iteration of our CIC Talks series that we'll be hosting this year. Look out for future ones in the coming weeks, and yeah, we appreciate you tuning in. And
yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Khaled, for facilitating this conversation.
Is that like corny to wave?
Yeah, bye.
No, it's okay. Bye. Have a good night.